Now, some of my followers are probably bewildered that I decided to make a serious analysis about a video game wherein a rooster and a handicapped puppy fight mestiza fascists. But Far Cry 6 aptly displays just how much social activism has impacted the gaming industry since 2015. And more importantly, the game is a window into the mental machinations of an industry growing increasingly detached from reality.
I want to live in a city again with my wife and not worry about being thrown in jail.
Hey, I want the same with my boyfriend. But how do we know Libertad is really on our side?
The moral paradigms on display also reflect larger social trends, and it's become all too apparent at this point that these games are now vectors for socio-political fantasies.
This isn't my war! When this is over, I'm still gonna have to fight to live here. It's like you forget that I'm trans in fucking Yara!
Typically in the past, Ubisoft has denied that their games are political in nature, but this time around they openly stated that Far Cry 6 is indeed political. Navid Kavari, the game's narrative designer, said the game engages in, quote, hard, relevant discussions about the conditions that lead to the rise of fascism in a nation, the costs of imperialism, forced labor, the need for free and fair elections, LGBTQ+ rights, and more, unquote. You might naturally ask yourself here, what setting could possibly cover all of this? Well, Far Cry 6 takes place in a fictitious present-day Caribbean nation called Yara. Cuba isn't exactly a one-to-one proxy, but it's clearly the backdrop. Yara is the name of a town in Cuba where a Taino cacique was burnt at the stake by the Spaniards for inciting rebellion. Tobacco and baseball are Yaran cultural staples, and Yara has been under an embargo since the 1960s after a revolution. The developers at Ubisoft even went down to Cuba to conduct research. Now, if you know anything about Cuba, you might be raising an eyebrow here, however, namely because Cuba has been communist and not fascist for the last 60 years. Oh, but of course, Navid Kavari also called the game a, quote, melting pot of motivational complexity, which is basically a license to say whatever they wanted about anything. Here's more of what he had to say at length. Quote, the original inspiration was guerrilla warfare, and what is that guerrilla fantasy, which is obviously tied to revolution. When you talk about guerrillas, you think of the guerrillas in the 1950s and 1960s. We actually went down there to speak to actual guerrilla fighters who fought back then, and we just really fell in love with their stories.
She would whisper regime secrets in my ear while stuffing dinero between my coconuts.
But we also fell in love with the culture and people we met. When we came out of that, it wasn't that we felt we had to do Cuba. We realized it's a complicated island, and our game doesn't want to make a political statement about what's happening in Cuba specifically. Beyond that, we're drawing inspiration from guerrilla movements around the world and throughout history. For us, it felt like doing the island of Yara would help us tell that story, while being very open with our politics and inspiration, unquote.
By the time we're through, Marquesa won't even have any ass-lift money left. Her fucking propaganda machine took our voice, so we got only one option left. Our bullets.
Do note here, though, that while Kavari was hesitant to discuss real-life Cuba, he had no issue bad-mouthing real-life Canada, which he proceeded to grossly misrepresent with a 2-bit imperialist Scooby-Doo-like villain.
How's it going there, backpack?
How do you think, you Yankee asshole?
Oh, well, Canadian asshole, actually. We're like Americans, except we say sorry as we slide the knife in. I'll bankrupt you in your dumb country, you and your backpack snot-nosed kids!
You hear that, libertards?
Now, the player assumes the role of Danny Rojas, a young Yaran trying to flee to Miami. Danny can be either male or female, but for the sake of simplicity, I will hereafter refer to Danny as male. The good guys are a guerrilla faction called Libertad, which is Spanish for freedom or liberty. The bad guys are the FND, or Las Fuerzas Nacionales de Defensa, which is Spanish for National Defense Forces. The nomenclature thus juxtaposes a vacuous notion of freedom against a tyrannical notion of nationalism.
Now go get those fascists, Tiger!
The FND are led by Anton Castillo, a fascist dictator who uses slave labor to cultivate a magical tobacco with special properties, which is used for a revolutionary cancer treatment product called Bibiro. When Far Cry 6 has various NPCs proclaim that Yara is not the world's medicine cabinet, they are indeed referring to the real-life criticisms against the Castro regime for its alleged abuses of its doctors and medical professionals. No, Cuba doesn't actually have a magical tobacco-based cancer treatment product, and they don't conscript slaves to cultivate tobacco either. But they do have a lung cancer vaccine called Simovax, which has received some hype in the international press. Simovax, according to some studies, has been shown to prolong the lives of lung cancer patients under the age of 60. Cuba also practices a lot of what's called medical internationalism. The small Caribbean island nation provides more medical personnel to the developing world than all the G8 countries combined. Cuba is well known all throughout Latin America for this, though there are criticisms of their programs. Some professionals in other countries feel that Cuban doctors are undermining local wages. Others doubt the validity of their medical credentials. Cuban medical professionals themselves have accused their own government of essentially treating them as slaves. Allegedly, the regime keeps something like 75% of the wages paid by the host nation. Once arrived in a given country, the doctors' passports are taken and they're closely monitored by Cuban officials so as to prevent defection. You can also find plenty of stories online wherein female doctors have been placed into precarious positions wherein they are either raped or forced to treat gang members at gunpoint. Now, perhaps all these criticisms and allegations are entirely valid, but the fact remains that Ubisoft chose to attack a fictitious hyperbolic fascist proxy inspired by Communist Cuba's alleged behavior. This is something Far Cry 6 does repeatedly. That is, it scapegoats a fascist boogeyman. But let's talk about the game's factions. Now, in total, there are 5 rebel factions in Far Cry 6, whom you are tasked as the player with uniting in the common cause of overthrowing Castillo's fascist regime. First, there's the aforementioned Libertad, which is led by Clara Garcia, a semi-white looking castiza woman from Yara's upper classes. And yes, her racial identity is relevant, but we'll discuss this more a bit later. Her main role at the game's outset is simply to convey the strong independent female archetype to the young male gamer. Men don't really lead revolutionary movements, women do. Next up, we have the Montero family, whose ancestral roots on the land go back 200 years. They're angry at Castillo for poisoning their land with Bebido slave camps. This is curious because if the Monteros have indeed been farming this land for 200 years, they almost certainly used to own slaves. In fact, their magical Negro friend, Freddy, is probably descended from them.
We fire solve the Philly magic. Time to work the Philly magic. Philly magic, babe.
Though to be fair, the Monteros are probably also descended from a few of them as well. The daughter, whose nickname is La Espada, is a knife-wielding badass. All throughout the game, you're constantly killing female FND troops, yet suddenly, when you first meet La Espada, there's a trail of all-male corpses leading up to a room where she's torturing another man she's captured. Her brother is a weak government scientist who betrayed the Montero family to go work for Castillo. La Espada is bigger and stronger than him, and the game juxtaposes her masculine features against his physical weakness. This likely had the effect of eliciting minor disgust reactions from the audience, which in turn helped bolster the sister's stance against fascism, quote-unquote, and undermine her brother's initial support of Castillo. Eventually, her brother is betrayed by the regime and sentenced to death for undisclosed reasons in order to draw out their father, Carlos, the Montero patriarch, and kill him. Carlos sacrifices his life to save his traitor son, however, and the rest of the Montero camp ends up hating the brother for this. Curiously, the same soldier La Espada was torturing earlier shows up at the father's funeral along with some other FND troops. It turns out they grew up on Montero land and were so upset at the death of Carlos that they decided to defect and become guerrillas. Absolutely no one questions their loyalty, why they didn't become guerrillas beforehand, or why they didn't hand over information willingly when La Espada was torturing them, and everyone continues to hate La Espada's brother. After the Monteros, we have Maximas Matanzas, a rap group comprised of a transgender man, Paulo, and her black girlfriend, Talia. Their sidekick is a whiny Mexican named Bicho, who says all the stereotypical Mexican catchphrases.
Radio Libertad is dead. We were the mouth of the revolution. Mouth.
The group's name, by the way, literally means maximum slaughters, and considering their general behavior, it seems quite appropriate. Paulo and Talia literally go around executing government officials for their crimes, such as, for example, using the wrong pronouns.
My academy was built to save fake Yarans like you and that marimacho you spread your perversions with. But where is she? Does she not approve of you playing with guns?
Next up, we have La Moral, which is Spanish for morals or ethics, and is led by a white yarn girl named Yelena, a super talented computer hacker who became a revolutionary after Admiral Benitez killed her classmates for liking Clara Garcia posts. And no, I'm not joking. The leader of La Moral's spy network is a homosexual named Gilberto. He is in fact a double agent, however, working officially for Castillo's regime as a drag queen. You can see his alter ego Rosamel Paquete all over the country's military recruitment posters. And once again, no, I'm not kidding. Yelena's second in command is yet another white yarn girl named Honoron, an ex-baseball player with bright red hair and an emerging six-pack. Her catchphrase is batter up and she's a vegan.
You getting the grill? You know how I feel about using that thing. Animals have goddamn brains too. You know dolphins can use tools?
Now, I do want to highlight here that there are indeed many white Cubans. This partially explains why, in stark contrast with other Hispanic Americans, Cuban Americans have historically voted Republican so consistently. Now, determining just how many white people there are in Cuba is a bit tricky, however, because the census goes by self-identification based on skin color and not genetic testing. Going by that, Cuba is supposedly about 64% white, which probably isn't very accurate. There's another study, however, by a Mexican university that places the number of white Hispanics in Cuba at around 37%. Personally, I would lean more toward that figure. As far as the rest of Cuba goes, it's probably mostly mestizos and mulattoes, followed by a small 10% African population. The last rebel faction in Far Cry 6 to introduce are the Legends, a group of old communist revolutionaries who overthrew Castillo's father back in 1967. But now, in 2021, they live up in the mountains in the eastern region of Yara. Clearly, Ubisoft was referencing the Sierra Maestra Mountains in Cuba, where Fidel Castro's forces based themselves in the 1950s. The personalities of the Legends are a black ex-athlete named El Tigre and two white yarns, a flamboyant poet named Lorenzo, who went around fornicating with yarn women during the '67 revolution, and a doctor named Lucky Mama, who looks like a Catwoman's romantic fantasy of being a communist rebel in the jungle. Now, since the Legends are ancianos, they end up having an important passing of the torch relationship with La Moral, who represents the new generation of radical revolutionaries.
You gotta sign my pants.
But the most bizarre aspect of Far Cry 6 is that there's virtually no discussion, or rather criticism, of the last 40-odd years of communist rule leading up to Castillo's election. In fact, the game vilifies the Castillo regime for rewriting the Legends as the villains in the National Museum.
I know there are many who speak of the old Revolution of '67 like a dream. That these murderers were heroes? They will destroy your future, just as they did my father's.
There's a vague notion that Yara was both communist and democratic, and that during the interim political period, Yara's economic depravity was mostly due to the American embargo. This depravity set the stage for the eventual rise of fascism. In 2014, when Anton Castillo ran for president, he claimed that his magical Bibiro product would help rebuild paradise by bringing immense wealth to the country. Now, the name Castillo was probably used because of its relative proximity to the name Castro, but Castillo's slogan of rebuilding paradise was probably Ubisoft once again referencing Donald Trump's Make America Great Again slogan. Do remember that they inserted an entire mission in Far Cry 5 that tasked you with helping a CIA agent hunt down Trump's P-tape. The cultivation of Castillo's magical tobacco requires the use of a fertilizer called PG-240 that, of course, poisons people and the environment. The evil doctor who invented PG-240 is quite a two-dimensional villain. He literally tells the player how much he likes to experiment on orphans and poor people. Anyone on the fringes of society, as he says.
You know, orphans like you make the best test subjects, along with the poor. Anyone on the fringe of society.
Indeed, the game is quite obsessed with the concept of social outcasts who are placed into Bibiro work camps by the fascist regime. But what does Ubisoft really mean by outcasts? Well, basically, homosexuals, transsexuals, and people with dyed hair and tattoos, or something along those lines. There's a sequence wherein you have to break into a facility to gather evidence of the regime's crimes. El Tigre asks you to search for a young girl with colorful hair and tattoos who apparently went missing some time ago. And of course, you find out that she was kidnapped and experimented on, presumably because she had blue hair and tattoos. Also note that when you start looking for Maximas Matanzas, you have to search their old hideout that they had to flee when the FND found out about them. They leave a note for you to find, indicating that Maria Marquesa, Yara's Minister of Culture, is in fact hunting down anyone who is different, and that if you are different and need to be free, you can come live with them in their hideout in the swamp. Once again, however, Ubisoft departs from reality. Today, Cuba is relatively progressive in terms of LGBTQ+ rights, and has been for some time. Fidel Castro's niece, Mariela, who has a master's degree in sexology, is the director of the Cuban National Center for Sex Education, and has been spearheading various initiatives. In fact, since 2008, Cubans can receive free government-funded sexual reassignment surgery. Though apparently, Communist Cuba wasn't always so nice to its homosexuals and transsexuals, and Mariela Castro acknowledges this in an online interview. Quote, "Homophobia was the norm, but this was the norm throughout the world. The institutionalized homophobia during the early years of the revolution reflected this reality, and was consistent with that epoch's culture. Making fun of homosexuals was natural, as was discounting and denigrating them," unquote. When asked what was the Cuban Communist Party's attitude toward homosexuality, Mariela responded with this, quote, "The Cuban Communist Party was the reflection of Cuban society, that is to say, macho and homophobic. A homosexual could not be a member of the party. Each time one was discovered, they were immediately expelled," unquote. Supposedly, even Fidel Castro himself said this in 1965, quote, "Never have we believed that a homosexual can personify the conditions and requirements of conduct that allow us to consider him a true revolutionary. Such a deviation conflicts with the concept we have of what a communist militant should be," unquote. There's actually a documentary called Conducta Impropia that aired in 1984 about how the Castro regime placed homosexuals into re-education camps during the 1960s. Though Mariela Castro denies that the regime specifically targeted homosexuals. Now, regardless of the true nature of what transpired during the 1960s, Ubisoft's Yara takes these themes, exaggerates them, and then pins them on a fictitious fascist dictatorship in 2021.
Binga! Who told you, fascista?
You call me Señor Presidente!
Again, Ubisoft has no problems bad-mouthing America and Canada for our perceived historical sins, yet for some reason feels a strong need to shield modern Cuba from public criticisms of its past behavior. With that in mind, working hand-in-hand with the evil Dr. Reyes, of course, is the aforementioned bombastic Canadian billionaire investor who is, in the words of Clara Garcia, sucking Yara's resources dry.
Foreign invaders like McKay Industries suck our resources dry.
But are Canadians really sucking Yara's resources dry? That is, Cuba's resources? Well, it's true that Canada has been permitted a certain amount of investment opportunities by the Castro regime, as have several other nations, such as China and Venezuela. Canada's largest investor at the moment in Cuba is Shurit International, which mines nickel in a 50-50 joint venture operation with the Cuban state company Cubanickel. Now, yes, there are some issues with environmental contamination, and yes, the Moa mine is projected to be exhausted in 20 years, but there are several things to consider here. First and foremost, Shurit International isn't turning a magical tobacco fertilizer into some chemical weapon, as our McKay Industries and the Castillo regime are doing in Far Cry 6. Shurit does actually produce fertilizer, but most of it is manufactured and sold in Western Canada. Second, Cuba had been mining nickel in Moa long before Canadians got involved in 1994, though an American mining firm, Freeport-McMoran, did operate in Moa until 1960 when Castro nationalized their facilities. Curiously, one of Cuba's metallurgic plants that opened later in 1984 was named Ernesto Che Guevara, so even if the situation were anywhere near as bad as Ubisoft is suggesting, it literally has a communist face plastered on top of it, and not some chubby Canadian billionaires.
So the next time you you hear something or you see something about an injury at one of my plants, just keep in mind that none of my Canadian sites have this problem. So don't be an idiota, and you won't get hurt.
Now, with this in mind, Fidel Castro brought in the Canadians because the Freeport McMoran facilities were running below capacity. By 1997, however, output at the MOA facilities under the joint Sherritt-Cuban venture had increased to 26,500 tons, more than twice its 1994 production. Why is this relevant? Well, it shows that Yarans, quote-unquote, actually wanted to suck their own resources dry, but were not effective. Amusingly, as of September 2021, Sherritt and Cuba are expanding their joint operations due to the, quote, growing demand for high-purity nickel and cobalt being driven by the accelerated adoption of electric vehicles, unquote. Perhaps this is something that the writers and activists at Ubisoft may want to consider as they drive to work in their electric cars to develop their next politically correct game using their electronic devices with nickel components. Far Cry 6 also puts a negative slant on gringo tourism to Cuba. Now, they don't discuss it openly, but there are periodic comments about it if you happen upon the resorts on the island. It's subtle, but the game massages the idea that tourists are yet another form of pesky foreign exploitation. Indeed, Cuba has grown, increasingly dependent on tourism since the 90s, and Canadian tourism has steadily risen to over 30% of Cuba's $3 billion annual tourist industry. Now, to be fair, the Cuban government does basically use the industry to funnel money to its military.
And Gaesa operates typically by signing management contracts with Western hotel companies to manage hotels that are owned by the Cuban military. The staff are also typically provided by Gaesa through its employment agency, which collects money from the Western hotel management company, but keeps most of it and gives only a very small amount to the Cuban worker, maybe $50 a month or so.
So we can argue that Canadians are inadvertently helping this repressive regime. Though, curiously, Gaesa, the military firm that manages Cuba's hotels and collects this money, recently opened a hotel for the LGBTQ+ community.
But this resort is great because you feel comfortable, you feel welcome, and it's great to tap into this industry because you get a lot of people from Canada who are looking for a safe space to come, especially in the Caribbean, and it's nice to feel welcome and to feel very much like you are part of the community and welcome into the community, and that people at the resort respect you and they respect the partners that you have, and it's just been very, very nice.
The East is safe. Am I right?
Right.
No prea capus por nada.
The bottom line is that Cuba is a net importer of merchandise and has run a trade deficit in goods for the last 40 years. Low agricultural productivity and weak food value chains mean that the country depends on imports for at least 70% of its domestic food requirements. Now, while there may be a worthwhile discussion here about how the embargo has unjustly harmed Cuba and how foreign investments undermine national sovereignty, Ubisoft doesn't address the topics with any fairness or nuance. They basically vilify Canada's historical collaboration with Cuba because of how said collaboration has enabled a repressive regime, while they simultaneously condemn the American blockade of the same repressive regime. But that's the curiously consistent thing about Far Cry 6's storyline. In Yara, there was a revolution in 1967 that overthrew Antón Castillo's father. Again, the game is quite vague about what transpired in the interim period beyond the fact that there was 47 years of blockade, which caused economic hardship for Yarans. But the real oppression against social outcasts only began once the fascist Castillo gained power and dismantled the nation's democratic institutions in 2014. Again, a core idea is that Castillo only gained power because of the American sanctions that made Yarans suffer economic hardship and thus desperate to believe his lies. Indeed, Far Cry 6 always has a funny way of finding an angle from which it can criticize all the real-life gringos up north, no matter our respective behaviors, and then proceed to depict us as the prime mover of fictional Yara's problems. Consider here that China and Venezuela import more goods and materials from Cuba than does Canada, and that China has invested heavily in nickel mining and tourism in Cuba. Yet Ubisoft didn't feel the need to depict the Chinese as foreign imperialist invaders, now did they?
Even in my country, Canada, go look up what they did to the indigenous folks and the fracking, Jesus Murphy. But hey, nobody is perfect.
Talk all you want. You're nothing but a fucking invader.
Of course, Ubisoft had to ram in some commentary about Canada's past interactions with the indigenous peoples of North America into a game supposedly about a fascist Caribbean dictator. It's worth noting here that the game's narrative designer is actually Canadian himself, which isn't all that surprising since the studio that developed the game is based in Toronto. But Naveed Kavari is Canadian by way of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. This is depressing because it goes to show, potentially, just how ungrateful he is. And it does raise the question, if Canadians are nothing but fucking invaders, then what's that make Naveed Kavari? Why should his refugee status somehow grant him a special exemption? Is he too not a fucking invader of indigenous people's land? Also consider here how Ubisoft tries to goad the player into killing McKay when they present you with an option to let him leave in exchange for money.
Long story short, guys like me always get away because, well, we're smarter than you. We think on another level. I'm not going to apologize for being genetically superior to you people.
With the you people again. I can't believe I'm not shooting you right now.
Also note here that in Far Cry 5, a caricatured Montanan redneck running for state senate endlessly makes fun of Canadians for being super progressive and having too many gender pronouns. Yet now when that caricature is inconvenient, it has to take a backseat to something more expedient. What's more intriguing here, though, is that Far Cry 6 simultaneously has you battling the concept of foreign colonialist invaders, while also battling Yaran nationalism itself. One moral hook meant to have you accept Castillo's villainy is that he has an idea of who is a true Yaran and who is a fake Yaran. Let's listen to his explanation to his son Diego.
Mio, the difference between a true Yaran and a fake Yaran, it can be hard to see, but it's there. A true Yaran understands that loyalty to country is key to his survival. Not justice, not love, not even family. Loyalty to a vision that looks beyond themselves.
Come mierda.
Fake Yarans love to be the outcasts. They are addicted to their selfish perversions. Chaos, lies, like wild dogs. But dogs can be broken. They can serve paradise. And if a dog refuses to break, like Julio here, like Clara Garcia, like Libertad, then we must put them down.
Ubisoft's goal here is to associate Castillo with anyone in the real world who talks about national loyalty and disapproves of degenerate social behavior. Anyone who speaks out against perversions and advocates nationalism are just like this fascist who tortures people in a dark, dank dungeon and uses violence and intimidation to achieve his goals. But curiously, Clara Garcia and her rebels all repeatedly advocate the use of violence and intimidation to achieve their goals. Now, no, I'm not going down the road of they're the real fascists. The point here is cognitive dissonance. Talia murders Yara's Minister of Culture for using the wrong pronouns. La Espada tortures captives to instill fear against her enemies. La Moral puts the dead body of Admiral Benitez on public display. The legends do voice some half-hearted concerns about this, but it doesn't really stop them from continuing to fight alongside the group and eventually embrace them as their spiritual successors. Early on in the game, the idea is presented to the player that a revolution is not won by the fearless, it's won by the feared. Clara Garcia even makes a big speech about the concept.
Rules of the guerrilla, Juan Cortez. A revolution is not won by the fearless.
Is won by the feared.
What does Anton Castillo fear? Free elections, free expression, free outcasts. Ayara free of Castillos. But he will fear nothing unless you are willing to die for your freedom today. Not when we have more believers or more guns, today. Because today I'm going to punch a hole through Castillo's warships! I am not fearless. I am scared as hell. But I promise you one thing. I will be feared.
Clara Garcia claims that Castillo fears free and open elections, yet supposedly Castillo won a free and open election. La Espada even admits to having voted for him because she believed his lies. Now perhaps he did lie, but he still has many supporters, as evidenced by the myriad women you're constantly slaughtering in the FND.
Fuck you!
Castillo did eventually do away with free elections, and the reason he cites is Clara Garcia's terrorist activities. But if Clara Garcia and her people are literally torturing and assassinating legitimate, democratically elected public officials who simply don't align with her political views, was Castillo entirely wrong? Consider here that Juan Cortez, the ex-CIA, ex-Mossad, ex-KGB asset, tells the player to inflict as much chaos as possible in the country, and even states at various points that for a guerrilla, the revolution never ends. Clara Garcia even openly discusses how her revolution won't solve anything and will only usher in another cycle of violence and civil war.
What are you going to do if you win, Presidente Garcia?
The next president won't last 6 months before they are assassinated.
Wait, what?
It's the truth.
Won't free elections solve that? What happened to your list?
It's a vision, Danny. But I'm not as naive as you think. This revolution will free Yara, but won't fix it. When we take the capital, Yara will be burning. Will be civil war, factions, warlords, foreign-backed coups. Take your pick.
Yarans will be killing Yarans for a generation.
Uh-huh. This fight will take the rest of my life. Yara is stuck in a cycle of tyranny and revolution. My job is to show us how to break it.
This isn't a dream, is it? You have to do this.
What makes you say that?
No one would choose this.
No, Danny. Everyone who follows me, who joins Libertad, chooses this.
Far Cry 6's moral posturing, almost without exception, eventually contradicts itself. Castillo's fascism is sexually progressive insofar that it includes women in prominent roles, but it's sexually oppressive insofar that it discriminates against the trans community. Literally, over half the enemy combatants you fight are women, and yet there's a scene wherein Castillo explains to Admiral Benitez that he only hired her because she's a woman.
I've always taken a personal interest in your career. Handpicked you out of the academy. But make no mistake, there were more experienced, more qualified, and more intelligent officers in line before you. You stood out for one simple reason.
Sí, señor presidente.
You were a woman in uniform. And now you could be the highest-ranking woman ever to have her head on a pike.
Gracias, señor presidente.
This kind of cognitive dissonance is again a general trend. There's an early scene in the game wherein one of Castillo's soldiers forces a local woman to hand over her fishing boat.
But my boat is all I have, senor. I can't feed my family if I can't fish.
Not my problem. Your boat, or I report you.
The scene is meant to convey just how evil the FND troops are because this is the woman's only means of sustenance. But then, later on, La Espada literally tells the player that she herself stole someone's fishing boat for your revolutionary activities.
Nice boat. Is it yours?
No, I stole it. Papa taught me how to hotwire tractors when I was a kid. Boats aren't so different.
In another scene, Dani Rojas explains to Juan Cortez that he's stolen cars his whole life.
Danny, the only thing better than a guerrilla is a guerrilla with a nice ride.
You want me to steal one? Been doing that since I was a kid.
Of course, the game periodically insinuates that any criminal activities Yarans engage in is a direct result of the American embargo.
I'm a pirate first, fisher second. Thank the blockade for that.
As previously mentioned, Paulo's sex conversion is a repeated talking point. A local surgeon even praises her for undergoing top surgery without any anesthetic. And of course, there was no anesthetic because of the evil Yankee blockade, so that's our fault too.
When I did Paulo's top surgery, there was no anesthetic. Black market hookup fell through. Even then, Paulo didn't blink.
Shit. Now, I do think there's a worthwhile discussion to be had about whether or not the American embargo is justified at this point, but Ubisoft doesn't really tackle the Cuban question with any of the nuance the topic might merit. The game somehow always manages to take an anti-American, anti-Canadian stance, no matter the context. America is bad because it engages in the embargo, but Canada is also bad because it bypasses the embargo and thereby supports a fascist, quote-unquote, regime in the process. But let's discuss for a moment some of the game's racial themes. While they're not the primary focus, they do periodically come up. Juan Cortés belittles the player, Dani Rojas, for wanting to move to America to escape Yara's cycle of violence.
America is my option.
Of course. And you think Americans want your Yaran blood? The American dream is for Americans, Danny.
Clara Garcia parrots the same talking point later on, explaining to Danny that the American dream doesn't come in their skin color.
What's your plan when you reach America?
Me and my friend Alejo were going to work shit jobs until we could scrape up some money. Open a body shop. If the Yankee blockade taught us anything, it's how to keep things running when you got nothing.
That's the dream? Sure, Yankees might pay you to park their cars or pick their fruit, but you'll never be one of them. The American dream doesn't come in our color.
Okay.
Talia also parrots the same talking points to Paulo whenever she discusses getting a record deal in America for Maximas Matanzas.
Fuck, Talia, we can have a life there.
Oh yeah, smile at the Yankees while we clean their toilets. Smile while they tell us to go back to where we came from. They don't want us, Paulo. My life is here, fighting with Libertad.
This idea here that the American dream doesn't come in their color is a little bizarre considering just how many places in America are majority Latino and Spanish speaking. Miami is basically Little Havana. You can literally call businesses there and the person answering the phone won't be able to speak English. Again, many Cuban Americans are white, but Far Cry 6 is clearly tapping into racial dynamics here. As I mentioned at the outset of this video, Clara Garcia's racial identity is relevant. In a flashback sequence to the pre-guerrilla days, Talia tells Clara that Clara had a privileged life growing up because her fair skin gave her access to special dreams and opportunities.
My mama used to tell me, save the dreams for the rich, fair-skinned Yarans. Us, we don't get to dream. We survive.
Even Anton Castillo himself at one point brings up how his Afro-Yaran mother's skin was the wrong color during her lifetime to engage in politics in Yara. And more interesting still is that when a white American journalist questions his use of slave labor to cultivate tobacco, Castillo has this to say.
Slavery was your first corporation, 1800 to 1860. Cotton was your #1 export. Grown by whom?
Just a second.
Slaves. 4 million Americans worth $3.5 billion. The #1 asset in your economy was people who look like me. What is that called?
A history lesson?
A head start. Replaced by a billion-dollar prison industry that pays its inmates pennies.
America is not alone.
Correct. Children sew our clothes. Sweatshops build our phones, and Bibiro saves millions of lives. Do you think that those lives care where it comes from?
Now, one might argue here that Castillo only highlighted America's past because he was speaking to an American reporter. But note Castillo's specific language. He calls America's slavery a, quote, head start. This is a talking point specifically meant to attribute all of America's success to black slavery. Yet, Brazil had far more slaves than America did, and look at it. The Middle East trafficked even more Africans than Europeans did, and yet, look at it. And the reason why that particular region has no significant black diaspora today is because the males were all castrated. Though Navid Kavari doesn't appear to have been very interested in ham-fisting that discussion into the game. Also note that Castillo frames America's for-profit prison industry as America's successor to slavery. This is another left-wing talking point. Now, yes, the prison system does have some for-profit elements that should be abolished, but this argument is still silly. Blacks are overrepresented in the prison population today, but consider that in 1860 there were almost 4 million slaves. Today, there are roughly 1.4 million Americans incarcerated. Of these, 7% of state prisoners and 16% of federal prisoners are held in privately run facilities. Again, all this is quite remarkable. Far Cry 6 uses a fictitious fascist Cuban proxy to accuse real-life American prison policies of being racist. So we could go on analyzing various aspects of Far Cry 6, but I don't think this is necessary. The dynamics of the game's political messaging and struggles can largely be understood by watching just 2 clips at this point, one from Clara Garcia and the other one from Anton Castillo. First, let's listen to Clara Garcia.
Free elections, free expression, free the outcasts. A Yara free of castigos. These are the 4 pillars of libertad. Castillo wants you to believe there is only one voice in Yara. His. Your voice? It doesn't matter. I am Clara Garcia, and I hear you. Libertad hears you. And we won't stop fighting until every Yaran is heard. And not only that, we won't stop until every Yaran is free to live their life true to themselves, no matter the race, gender, sexuality, or creed. Join Libertad. Refuse to be silenced. Refuse to be erased.
Clara Garcia wants a society in which there is no authority, no restrictions, no discrimination of any sort, except of course against those who desire some semblance of order. Essentially, she's the embodiment of modern leftism. Remember the rules of the guerrilla: the revolution never ends, and every guerrilla is the leader of their own revolution. It doesn't stop at any point, it just gets worse and worse. But let's listen to Anton Castillo now.
Señor Presidente, have you anything to say to someone who would dare to follow the Terroristas Libertad and their disgusting leader, Clara Garcia?
I am El Presidente. You elected me to lead Yara. Our people chose order, discipline, and peace. No one chose Libertad. No one chose chaos. And chaos is the nature of our world. It surrounds us. It consumes us. It's in our phones, on our TVs. Its opinions masked as truth. In one word, noise. The world is being strangled by choice, strangled by freedom.
Have you ever considered teaching philosophy, Señor Presidente?
Libertad will tell you that I am here to take your choices away. They are right. This is the reason that you elected me. You elected clarity. I know what each and every one of you craves in your hearts. I am order. I am discipline. I am certainty. I am Yara. If I am El Presidente, then you are El Presidente.
Clara Garcia is chaos, and Anton Castillo is order. Now, Ubisoft wouldn't agree with that framing because that framing is, in their view, fascist, quote unquote. But in effect, in the war of chaos versus order, Far Cry 6 celebrates and takes the side of chaos.
That tank is your brush, and Yara is your canvas. Take chances, make mistakes, embrace the chaos.
Of course, there will be those who claim that Ubisoft was making a legitimate effort here to explore the cost of revolution and examine both sides. But Ubisoft certainly wasn't saying that Castillo ever had a point, that maybe the LGBTQ agenda has gone a little too far, that maybe women shouldn't try to be men, or that maybe Americans and Canadians have some redeeming qualities and we shouldn't be held eternally responsible for the third world's problems.